Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar from Axiomatics. Today, our topic is the 5 hidden pitfalls of do-it-yourself access control. Now today, as usual, there's a few webinar guidelines for you. Your microphones are muted so that we have a good, clean recording of this webinar today. And the link to that recording will be available to you shortly after this session. As always, we also have time for Q&A at the end of our presentation, so you can use the GoToWebinar control box where you can put in your question anytime. If we're able to, we can address them as we go, but otherwise we'll do that at the end of the session. So today, I'm your host, Jerry Gable with Axiomatics, and I'm happy to be joined by Dan Beckett, a former colleague of mine during our Burton Group days. Dan, do you want to introduce yourself and just say a little bit about Security Architects Partners? But you have to unmute yourself to do that. Hello, Mr. Beckett. Are you out there in the internet? All right, I'm going to let you sort out your connection issue there. But Dan is, like I said, a former colleague of mine at Burton Group, and we have worked together on a number of customer projects. These days, he runs with his own crew at Security Architects Partners and has dealt with a lot of customer cases where they are advising them on their identity and access management and broader security strategies. And it often comes up that whether to do it yourself or build your own is a decision to be considered. Dan, I'll give you a few more moments here to sort out your audio connectivity, and I'll proceed here with some of the topics we'll cover today. Sometimes we think that organizations don't fully acknowledge or recognize all the different aspects of a do-it-yourself project when it comes to identity and access management, or in this case, access control specifically. And so we want to focus on these 5 areas and how to avoid those pitfalls associated with the opportunity cost, how potentially your security policy environment can become fragmented over time, the whole cost of doing a full software development lifecycle, SDLC or DevSecOps kind of model. We also touch on other developer aspects like agile development processes, building a MVP or a minimally viable product, and how that relates to a overall security posture. And then lastly, we'll touch on the audit and regulatory compliance perspective, because as you know, we always need to deal with that aspect. So Dan, I'll do a sound check here. Are you back?
I am here. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I sure can. Good recovery
okay.
there.
Yeah.
I just introduced the topic here, but let's back up and just let you briefly introduce yourself before we move forward.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Jerry. For the folks on the call, my name is Dan Beckett. I work for a firm called Security Architects Partners, and Jerry and I met and worked together for many years during our Burton Group days, as Jerry had alluded to earlier. And Jerry, I don't think you made the transition over to Gartner when Gartner acquired Burton Group. Am I remembering that correctly?
Just for a brief time, maybe a couple months, yeah.
Right. So our firm, several of us in the firm did make that transition, but about 3 years ago, we went independent and we formed our own partnership, and we focus on security, privacy, identity, and risk. And I think, Jerry, you did an adequate job of introducing us, so we don't need to bore the audience any further with my background at this point, but
okay,
happy to be here, and sorry for the technical difficulties.
No, I'm glad I can hear you now, because otherwise I would have really been doing some PowerPoint karaoke and trying to do this myself. All right, so this is really the genesis of the webinar. So we had published an infographic and a white paper on this topic of DIY and hidden costs and so on. And Dan said, well, there's a number of other angles here that we can think about. And so that was really, the genesis or the instigation for coming together today. So really that Dan could share some of his broader perspectives and on these topics and others related to it, and bounce some ideas between the two of us, and then of course entertain your questions as we go along here. So Dan, the first one on the list here was this opportunity cost, and in fact as we were talking about this, is opportunity cost actually opportunity lost? So what are your thoughts on this particular topic?
Yeah, so the material that we pulled together after we had some conversation on this, Jerry, as you know, came from a series of anecdotes that are really driven out of some real-world engagements that we're currently working on. So the material is very fresh. The content and the concepts that we're going to talk about are very fresh. And, for the audience, normally if we were in the room together, we'd like to have this as kind of an open dialogue. It's probably not conducive to do that in a webinar, so save your questions for the end. But, the way I like to sort of walk through these is to just kind of pose some questions as if I were talking to the head of enterprise architecture or the CTO or even potentially the CISO or CIO. And so on the opportunity cost angle, and I know that in some of the prior materials that Axiomatics had put out on this topic, they did talk about some of the opportunity costs. But one of the things that we see, if we can think about access control being part of the broader set of security capabilities that an organization needs to deliver, you can think of access control as being part of that security portfolio. And I oftentimes advise my clients that, if you're not in the security business, if it's not something that you're making money from, does it really make sense for you to be trying to develop security functionality, particularly in this day and age when there's such a broad and mature set of security capabilities that you can deploy off the shelf? And I think there are a number of significant benefits to doing that. But from the opportunity cost perspective, the questions that we typically ask are, is it easier to recruit and retain security developers or general purpose application developers? And I don't know what folks are seeing across the country or even across the globe, but in our neck of the woods up here in Chicagoland, security developers are very, very difficult to find. It's a scarcity of resources. And so we've seen a couple of organizations that have attempted to build their own, and their projects have lagged or they've gotten less than optimal quality because they're spending so much time trying to find adequate resources. And I just don't think that for most organizations, if security isn't your core business, that this is really an ideal way to be spending your scarce resources when there are available solutions that can probably do a better job more quickly. The other thing is, another angle to look at this is that if security isn't your core business, you can almost look at a commercial off-the-shelf solution, a COTS solution in security, the security stack, as being a way to outsource, right? So one of the challenges is that you have to go through all of the rigorous testing and the development and QA. So let me use an example here. If you were to go out and try to build your own cryptographic solution, your own cryptographic library, most people would probably call you crazy, right? Because if you look at how encryption, how easily it can be broken if you're trying to do it yourself and it's not tested, it has to go through many, many, many years of testing to be proven reliable in the industry. So it pays, I guess, to be very cautious and to be very conservative when it comes to your security stack. Do you really want to be on the bleeding edge and developing and implementing technologies and self-written code that hasn't been subjected to a wide gamut of testing? And when I say that, I mean in not just within your own security testing regime, but across industry, being subjected to the rigors of being live out on the internet and having people, hurling rocks and stones and flaming arrows at it all day, every day. The other thing here is that when I mentioned that we oftentimes find ourselves working with enterprise architecture groups, so one of the key questions here is, is there an opportunity for you to simplify your security services through the use of standard solutions? And by standard solutions, I'm not referring to standards-based, but more having a set of architectural standards that the organization can reuse and deploy across their application stack. So the sort of the critical question comes down to this, are you exposing yourself to lost opportunity? Are your projects lagging behind because you're spending time trying to find scarce resources that really aren't in your core business? And so sometimes, so we have, one of the anecdotes here is we are working with a development bank, and because of some of the requirements that they had for information barriers that they were trying to implement with a fine-grained access homegrown solution, they actually had identified that they chose not to pursue certain business opportunities because they could not guarantee with the current homegrown solution that they had, that they would be able to actually implement the fine-grained information control barriers. And so we are in the process of working with them right now to remediate that and using a cost solution, right? So the idea here is that in some cases, opportunity cost is not just spending time, effort, and money on something that isn't core business, but you may actually end up avoiding risk and thereby missing opportunity, thinking about the fact that opportunity is the opposite of risk because your security stack really isn't up to the task if you attempt to build it yourself. So that's just a real world anecdote that we've seen. Jerry, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things, Dan. I mean, to your last point there. So that would be a real case where security is an enabler, and in this case, enabling the organization to manage the risk appropriately so they could proceed on that business opportunity. Is that fair to say?
That's absolutely right. I'm glad you brought that point up, right? Because we often like to encourage the security folks, the security organization, to position themselves as an enabler for business rather than an impediment. So, oftentimes security orgs find themselves in the situation where they're always having to say no, right? And this is an exact illustration of that point, that security can actually be an enabler to actually go out and capitalize on opportunity that you might otherwise avoid. Great point.
Mm-hmm. And secondly, I would just follow up on your comment here about the cost and scarcity of security developers. I think that's a universal challenge for organizations, both for end user enterprises, government entities, or software vendors like ourselves. Good talent is super hard to find these days in the current global employment market.
That's right. I mean, security is really what we call a negative unemployment field right now, and I'm just not convinced that it's, I mean, it's great for all of us on this call, probably, job security, right? But I'm just not convinced that if security isn't your core line of business, that's really where you should be spending your scarce resources trying to find those kinds of high talent, high cost developers.
Great. Okay, great. Let's go on to the next topic then of simplicity and fragmentation. When we were prepping for this session here, I really liked your discussion points about this topic.
Right, and so the title from this actually comes from, there's an actor, and I don't know much about the guy, but I found this quote and I thought, hey, this is very, very appropriate to what we're discussing here. And the actual full quote is that the opposite of simplicity is not complexity. The opposite of simplicity is fragmentation. And, this is something that we are seeing every day at a number of organizations where, every day somebody comes to the architecture review board with yet another open source product that they want to implement because it does, it has some bell and whistle that hasn't been implemented, and it's going to save the developers time because they don't have to develop the libraries themselves, kind of reinforcing the point, is security really something you want to be developing in-house? But the point here is that, when I look at what's going on in the app dev space, where organizations are moving to microservice architectures and they're deploying them into cloud and hybrid cloud type environments, with the proliferation of all of these tools for implementing various levels of security, it strikes me that we are really moving pretty dramatically in a very difficult direction where we have all of these variety of tools that have different pieces of security functionality. and they all impact our security policy, but we have no way, there's no single pane of glass, there's no way for us to be able to really see, is the policy implemented the way we expect it to be? And so the other thing that we see in organizations that have attempted to build this on their own is that they end up developing security silos for different lines of business. And so, you know, when you think about a large enterprise that has multiple lines of business and they're doing all of this custom development work to develop, you know, core business functionality that is targeted on the needs of a specific business unit, if they include developing security in there, the reality is that it's going to be very difficult for that organization to normalize how they manage security across that portfolio. And so what we see is that you end up fragmenting not only the technology, but more importantly, the security policy. And so this sort of ties into the point that we made on the previous slide about architectural standards. I'm very, very concerned, and I think that you don't have to look any further than the latest, you know, AWS, you know, a storage container misconfiguration, right, where information was left naked sitting out on somebody's AWS storage container because somebody just missed the configuration. That's a perfect example. I mean, there was actually one scenario that we heard of one of our clients. They provide services to a Scandinavian federal government, and somebody misconfigured the S3 container, and a whole bunch of defense contracting information was left out and exposed on the internet. And we're hearing these horror stories more, you know, more and more frequently. So this is a real problem, the fragmentation of security policy, and it kind of leads to that fourth bullet point there, which is that is the policy that you intend actually getting implemented? And how do you verify that? How do you actually test that if you have silos of development that each are using a different set of technologies? How do you ever get to the point where you actually know that the security policy has been implemented the way that you need to? I think there's actually, you know, probably an opportunity here for, you know, some company to come in here and be able to sort of sort that out. But in the meantime, until that product appears on the marketplace, you know, I really think that it makes sense from a security perspective for us to try to simplify the technology stack that we use to deliver security services. And among that is, you know, certainly in the space of fine-grained access control, you know, the idea is that there can be different degrees of how much fine-grained is required across the different stacks, but a solution, you know, such as the Axiomatics solution can really help you drive some normalization across how you're implementing those policies across a wide range of use cases. The other thing that we've seen too is where security logic ends up getting embedded in API calls. So, you know, developers, you know, will often take these shortcuts where rather than try to implement security policy in a policy configuration or policy engine, they just write code, right? It's what they do. And I'm just not convinced that, that's good for security hygiene. Jerry, have you seen this as well in some of the clients where you've gone in and implemented your product?
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. I think you know, silos already of security policy already exist, you know, just from a legacy bad practice approach, or maybe not bad practice, but not optimal practices being followed. And now we see some of those, you know, less than desirable practices being performed when, you know, we're building API-based applications and microservice-based applications. And I know we talk a little bit more about that coming up. But yeah, we see that same practice now in too many cases. So this is another area where you're allocating resources to do that security logic, but also, by the way, it ties into the compliance factor later on that now this is more security logic that may be invisible from a governance and compliance perspective. And then finally, Dan, on this slide here, the policy intended, does that equal what's implemented? We've definitely heard from customers where using custom coding practices across multiple applications, their confidence level of that consistency was pretty low, you know, because you're using maybe different programming languages or slightly different data models across different applications. And they definitely had some lack of confidence there of the policies being that they were enforcing the compliance standards that were required by them.
Yeah, we've seen that too, and I did want to share too that one of the real world scenarios that we got involved with was an organization. I won't even disclose what industry they're in because it's pretty sensitive, but they did suffer a pretty significant breach, and one of the challenges that they had was that because of this fragmentation across their application stack, there was a penetration due to an open source zero-day exploit, but because of the fragmentation across their environment, they eventually just threw up their hands. They were never actually able to get to a forensic investigation that conclusively identified exactly what went wrong. And part of that was because part of the stack was encrypted. They didn't have the ability to decrypt, traffic that was going on the network. But the real sort of root cause when we came in and did the post-breach analysis was that the environment was so complex that there was no one person or one place to go. And then there were little things like, the network time protocol wasn't synced across all of the components. I mean, just a whole slew of small but critical mistakes that made it impossible for them to actually figure out what caused the breach in the first place. So these things have real ramifications, right? This is not just fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I mean, we've seen this firsthand. This has real implication. And so I'm a very, very strong proponent of having a more simplified security environment. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not complex, but we definitely want to move away from having fragmented security policy because it has real impact to the organization.
Great, absolutely. All right, fair enough. So next up, DevSecOps.
Right, and so the point here is if kind of back to the topic that we talked about on the first slide about if your core business isn't security, should you really be developing security capability? If you look at the OWASP top 10 list, right, that list there, defining requirements all the way down to handling all errors and exceptions. I mean, these are the top 10 things that organizations should be doing to harden their code. And while to a certain extent, if you're doing custom development, I recognize the fact that you probably have practices around this, but the point that I'm making here is that from a security perspective, do you really, is your organization really set up to handle the backlog and the very specific technical details that relate to how security capabilities function end to end? And do you really want to take on the burden of doing all these 10 things? Now, and of course, this is just the top 10. There's a lot more that OWASP talks about in terms of secure code development. It's hard enough, in my opinion, to do it for developing business functionality. I just don't see the point of overburdening the development staff and the whole DevSecOps environment with having to do this for the entire security stack as well. So another way to look at this is that by using commercial solutions, this is all capability that is essentially, built into that product. And so what you're buying is not just the product itself and the capability that it brings to you from a security perspective, but you're really buying, and I like the point that you brought up, Jerry, about, the level of assurance or certainty on the previous slide, right? What you're really buying is a high degree of certainty that the code has been developed in a secure way that has been tested across multiple environments in real world pen testing and actually real world live fire shooting exercises, so to speak, to use an analogy, right? So if you look at the three key points here, right, is your source code control robust enough to actually manage security issues? It's one thing to do it for developing business functionality, but you have to look at everything from your source code repository, how you're doing issue tracking, if you're using Jira or some other ITSM type solution. And then the one thing that we've seen many organizations miss is the open source compliance piece, right? So there are solutions out there like Black Duck that can, sort of help you stay on top of the open source. But one of the things that we've seen is this, I like to call it open source sprawl in organizations that do a lot of custom development. And this sort of, it sort of augments the conversation that we were having on the previous slide about the complexity of the environment. But, many organizations that are doing open source type development work really have very poor practices when it comes to testing those libraries and making sure that they're robust. So, I mean, if you have good practices in this area, that's one thing. But if you're shaky to begin with, just in developing business functionality, then it's probably even more of a reason to kind of shy away from developing security. The other thing that people often get tripped up on, we've seen organizations get tripped up on this issue of key management and who's holding the keys and how you're doing secrets management. And this is another area where I think that the commercial solutions are heads and shoulders above a lot of the open source solutions. I've just seen a lot of organizations, or a lot of open source solutions that just are not up to snuff with being able to do the privileged access management pieces, the workflow around that, being able to accommodate break glass scenarios as it relates to provisioning and managing those service accounts. And so these are all things that you have to think about when you're doing DevSecOps for security capabilities. One of the things that we've seen organizations end up doing here is performing these features manually because they don't have very good automated processes around this. We had a conversation with a defense contractor, for example, where one of the things that they needed to be able to do was they were trying to do attribute-based access control. In fact, they are an Axiomatics customer. But the thing that they had overlooked was how do we actually do the lifecycle management of the attributes that go into that solution. And they were trying to do that with some homegrown solutions. And they really had not thought about the architecture that goes into how you actually do the business process and the workflow around managing those attributes. And I've seen that at a number of organizations where they overlook the workflow. In fact, one of our current clients, one of the things that we're working on with them right now is going through and helping them with some remediation efforts around some audit findings that they had because they deployed some open source capabilities that ended up coming in scope for PCI compliance. And they didn't have everything documented, and so we're having now to go back for a system that is in production. They're delaying a release of a major feature because they have to be able to go and improve compliance to PCI, and they didn't anticipate that. So the point here is, DevSecOps isn't free, and in fact, it's not even cheap, right? This is expensive, and I just think that it's better to get this out of the box than to try to do it yourself.
Well, then working with developers, this reminds me of a meme I've picked up somewhere along the way where you want to make the right path the easy path. And that, absolutely applies to children, I guess, and developers as well, not to malign children. But when you think about the modern way to build applications, all API and microservice focused, one of the aspects we've been thinking about a lot is, that the security infrastructure itself needs to be managed in the same way. So we see our customers, managing the authorization service as a microservice, and this way they can orchestrate with their typical orchestration tools like Kubernetes and build their continuous implementation, continuous development or deployment pipelines, incorporating the security functionality right with the the application functionality. So again, trying to remove those barriers, remove those impediments, so that the right way is also the easy way to approach this.
Yeah, and that's a really great segue into the next slide, right? This is so talking about agile and DevSecOps and lights out operations and automation, right? We've been having a very interesting debate amongst the partners in our firm about, whether or not agile security is an oxymoron, right? And so, one of the first things that always pops out to me when I hear these conversations about agile is that it seems to me, and I've seen this happen so many times, that agile is just a lame excuse to avoid requirements gathering and requirements documentation. And that's your cue to laugh for those folks that are muted on the call. But it really does bring up, I think, an important point, which is that do you really, if you think about minimum viable product and the typical way that we deploy, agile, and I sort of kind of, I kind of twitch a little bit when I hear about minimum viable product when it comes to security, because do you really want for your security features to be minimum at any stage in the process? And so, again, if you're developing and trying to develop in an agile paradigm, we've seen a lot of organizations really struggle with this. And if you actually go out and look, we've been doing a lot of writing and thinking, and in fact, helping a couple of clients in this space around agile risk management. There is a dearth of information about how to do good cyber risk management in an agile paradigm. And so a lot of the literature out there says, oh, agile is great because it has risk management built in, blah, blah, blah. But when you actually look at it, what they're talking about is they're talking about project risk management. They're not talking about security or cyber risk management. And there actually is a dearth of good literature on how to do good risk management in an agile way. And so one of the clients that we've done some work with in this space, they're one of the largest software and technology manufacturers in the world, about 500,000 people in the organization, 350,000 employees, 150,000 contractors. And they had an edict from the CEO that every project in that organization, not just development projects, but every project would be executed in an agile fashion, broken down to 9-member squads. And they're saying, okay, Dan, we want you to come in and help us figure out how to do this, how to do risk management in an agile way. And I'm scratching my head and saying, well, let's do some math. You know, what's 500,000 divided by 9? Let's see. You know, I'm not sure there are 50,000, skilled risk practitioners in the United States, let alone in your company. So we had to try to figure out a way, and I think we were pretty successful with that, on how to embed good, cyber risk management practices down to the squad level, how to roll it up into the overall enterprise risk portfolio. But the point that I'm bringing up here is that we have seen very, very few organizations that are equipped to be able to do risk management in that way. And then the other thing is that one of the other challenges that we've seen is that in many cases, the technology stack that is required in order to support this, in order to get, custom homegrown solutions plugged into the rest of the security stack, is that the security organization themselves often are not set up and organized to be able to deliver in an agile paradigm. And there's this real sort of what I call an impedance mismatch between the way some of the traditional security orgs are structured. And so all the more, if you're trying to develop security functionality and your security organization isn't set up to deliver in an agile way, you're probably going to hit some bumps along the way. So, these are, just some of the lessons learned that we've seen. This is, I think, an area of emerging maturity in the space. And, we're trying to provide some thought leadership in that. But, we'd love to have some more conversations if any of the folks on the call, have had experience on doing good cyber risk management in an agile delivery. Man, we'd really love to talk to you and compare notes on that. Jerry, you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually, I'll make the assumption in this case that the security organization is ready to address risk management in an agile way, just for the sake of argument here, and talk about a way that developers can be less than agile if they're trying to tackle a new program like PSD2 situation, where a financial institution is going to open up access to data and functionality. A way to make that less than agile is to try to build your own security model,
right,
in your own access control model while you're in the midst of an incredibly important program for your organization. You can spend several months or developer years working on something like that, where if you can just focus on the core functionality, that actually makes you more agile in that scenario.
Right. That's a great point, and I agree. That resonates with what we've seen at a credit card company and again this big software development firm. So I guess we're coming up. We got the last topic here, Jerry.
Yes.
So, this quote here is actually a riff on an old Jewish proverb. And the Jewish proverb says that taxes grow without rain. And I thought, well, hey, let's kind of riff on that a little bit. And I know everybody hates talking about regulatory compliance, but, you can't avoid the topic, particularly for some of these organizations that are in highly regulated industries, whether it be in finance, whether it be in healthcare, energy companies that we were doing work with, right? So we're working with an energy company right now, and they're one of the largest public utilities in a particular state, and their NERC and FERC requirements are very well understood, but they're very concerned because the state that they're in is considering adopting new regulations that are going to put significant burden on their software development shop, because they want to extend some of the regulatory requirements to the enterprise portion of the network, not just the SCADA network, right? And so every day it seems like there's new regulatory burden. Of course, everybody's I almost hate to utter the letters, but everybody's familiar with GDPR. And then, of course, now you've got all the copycat regulations that are popping up, from state of California. And I think there's 10 or 11 other states that are considering their sort of own GDPR-like kind of privacy regulation, right? So the point here is that these regulatory burdens are they're not going away, despite the big piles of paper that President Trump was showing with the big ribbon showing how much he's cutting regulation. But and that's not to get political about things, right? But it's simply to point out that these regulatory requirements are becoming more and more onerous and burdensome. And so one of the things that we saw at one of our clients was that, in fact, I referenced it on the prior slide, where they were having to go in and they had to hold up. They basically have taken an entire team of people that was dedicated to working on a major line of business application that they were modernizing. And it went through an audit, and there were a number of findings that came out of that audit. And it wasn't actually the core business functionality that got dinged. They were using some open source components to do secrets management and to do some service brokering. And they were trying to make the argument that those systems were not handling personally identifiable information and therefore shouldn't be in scope, but their regulator and their internal auditor didn't see it the same way. And so, what happened in this particular case was that the organization had not mapped out the dependencies across some of the subsystems that were pulling into a system that admittedly was under the scope of PCI compliance and under the scope of some regulatory regime as well. And so now they basically had to put an entire team of developers. I mean, we're talking, this is not a significant number of people. There were 30 people working on this, just as one piece of functionality alone. They had to put that whole project on hold. And now they've got a team of about 15 people that are trying to chase down all of the compliance requirements, put in remediation plans, and then actually go implement the remediations. And so this is putting them about 6 months behind where they wanted to be in terms of releasing this functionality. So again, a lot of these topics that we've talked about today are sort of interrelated, but this is just an anecdote to show how, trying to do it yourself can often have these unintended consequences. And it's really important, not to overlook the compliance burden, particularly if your organization is one that is under high regulatory burden. And so the things that you need to think about, are you really truly prepared for that compliance burden? What are you doing from a testing perspective, from a logging perspective? Are all the components that you're building, are they logging to standard? Are they logging to the right infrastructure? Are you able to monitor those things? There was a point on one of the other slides that we actually didn't get to, but we've also seen a pretty dire impact where organizations have deployed their own capability, and then they try to make the SIM and without proper coordination with their security operations center, and all of a sudden the security operations center is burdened down with a whole bunch of false positives because they didn't really plan out that integration very well. So these are all the things that you need to be thinking about. It's not just about building the code and making sure that nobody breaks in. You also have to prove, particularly if you're under regulatory burden, you also have to prove that you have the right controls in place. And so if you look at what the federal government has done in this space, they have a whole program called FedRAMP for agencies that are looking to deploy homegrown, custom-built solutions out to the cloud. They have a whole certification process. They call it a CNA, certification and accreditation, where those things have to go through a very rigorous testing and certification process that is all documented. And the cloud version of that is called FedRAMP. And so, one of the things that we've done for a couple of clients is help them sort of distill some of the good practices out of something like FedRAMP and apply it to their own internal process. Because again, if you've got regulatory burden and you don't have a good CNA process, even if it's one that's lightweight, you are going to have audit findings, and some of those can be pretty onerous to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Dan, on the flip side of that, I think there's another program addressing the monitoring. I forget the acronym or the full name, but it's something focused on continuous monitoring of environments. So yeah, we see that in the government space absolutely becoming a higher priority.
Right, and again, the point there is that picking up off of the fragmentation slide as well, is that you have to look at the whole. The regulators and the auditors are really looking for: do you have end-to-end understanding of what's going on in the environment? And if you don't, even if like in the particular case that I was citing before, where the company tried to make the argument, well, our secrets management solution isn't dealing with cardholder information, therefore it shouldn't be in scope of PCI. However, the point is that if that secrets management system went down, guess what happens to the main system, right? So you have to look at the dependencies. You have to have, if you're going to try to do this yourself, you have to look at all of those dependencies, be able to map those out, and approach this holistically. So our recommendation here is, to have a well-defined certification and accreditation process to walk you through that. So.
Excellent. Well, Dan, we wanted to wrap up here just with some closing comments before we take a couple minutes to address questions from the audience. So I'll remind you to put that in the GoToWebinar control panel for questions. But so Dan, you and I were trying to highlight some issues today for folks to consider. Looking at potentially those unintended consequences of a do-it-yourself approach. And we're just looking to share some opinions here based on a lot of experience and exposure to so many of these projects with various kinds of enterprises. So we hope these insights have been helpful to you and to give you a more informed decision-making process. And we're happy to entertain a couple of questions here before we wrap up this webinar today. And Dan, one that's come in, and I've heard this before, is there a case where you can justify a do-it-yourself access control project? I think several years ago that was probably possible. For example, when there was no or very limited commercial solutions available, would you say that's a viable place to wade into this kind of excursion?
Yeah, I would. And the other thing that I'd like to sort of point out there is that I always like to take the discussion about access control and sort of divide it into two sides of the same coin. The one side being the runtime piece, the other side being the admin time, or what I call the lifecycle management piece, right? And so from a runtime perspective, the space that, for example, Axiomatics is in, I mean, think about it this way, right? No, well, I shouldn't say nobody, right? But few organizations today are going out and building their own authentication mechanisms, right? We're typically plugging into other capabilities, things like SAML, OAuth, JWT, things of that nature are pretty robust, right? We don't need to go out and invent and develop new authentication methods. Obviously, the access control side of that, the enforcement of policy was a little bit slower to mature and gain widespread adoption. But I would say that, in the last 10 years, we've really seen pretty robust maturation in that space. So on the runtime side, I really don't see that it makes much sense, frankly, to attempt to build your own. And part of the reason for that is, all the things that we've talked about here on this one because of some of the hidden costs, but also because in most cases, when we've seen people attempt to build their own, what they end up doing is building to some minimum set of requirements that is not easily portable to other use cases because they didn't anticipate, because they hadn't seen it before. And they either end up developing a whole bunch of custom solutions, or they end up layering in a bunch of spaghetti code on top of the original solution that may have been originally quite lean and quite efficient, but over time, as they try to burden it with more and more capability that they hadn't anticipated, begins to sag under its own weight. So on the runtime side, I really don't see that there's much of a business case these days to roll your own. On the lifecycle management, it's a little bit different. And the reason I say that is because on the lifecycle management side, how you provision the attributes, and again, this is not really a space that Axiomatics is directly in, right? But on the lifecycle management side of it, how you provision the attributes is really tied very, very closely to your business process. So there are some cases on the lifecycle management side where maybe it makes sense because it is so intrinsically linked to the business process about how you request and grant access control. But even in that space, as things like SailPoint and ServiceNow IT service management type solutions are becoming more and more popular and sort of expanding their footprint and their capabilities, we're seeing less and less appetite and interest in really sort of business justification even on that side of it. But that would be the rare case where I would say it might make sense on the life cycle side.
Right. Okay, excellent. Is there a question in your queue, Dan?
I'm not.
I've got one follow up to that. Maybe we'll finish up with this one. So if there is a case where I'm building my own functionality, is there anything in particular you would recommend if I expect at some point in the future I'll migrate that to a commercial offering? Because certainly we've seen that, where there's a homegrown entitlements service that ultimately gets converted over to Axiomatics commercial. Are there any particular recommendations you could make if you do in fact embark on a DIY?
Yeah, so the thing that we try to do in this space, because in most of the projects where we're working in sort of the fine grained space, it's rarely a situation where you've got a greenfield environment where you're building something completely from scratch, right? It's usually a situation where you're going through modernization. And so you have to have the ability to be able to harvest, understand the existing access policies, even if the current, so we're actually, the building that I'm sitting in today is a client that graciously allowed me to use their conference room, and this is exactly what we're helping them with, is that they have a legacy system that they are attempting to modernize. And, the issue that they're having is that while they know that the existing policies aren't always necessarily 100% correct, in other words, in many cases they have over-provisioned access out of a fear of preventing people from being able to do their jobs, they still, when they deploy the new solution, they still need to be able to have the policies as intended get implemented in the new solution. So kind of a long-winded way of getting around to the real answer to your question, which is that, some of the things that we've been working with several of our clients on is developing the taxonomies for fine-grained access control. And the other thing that I would say is that, you have to understand and develop sort of a series of hypotheses around what the right policy model is based on the application and how fine-grained the access requirements actually are. In some cases, we see the business actually thinks that their requirements are more fine-grained than what they actually need to be after we go through and do some analysis work, right? So there are some methods that you can develop to be able to, number one, harvest and identify what the current policies are, and then to develop a taxonomy around fine-grained access, around how a syntax for developing the policies in plain English that can then be easily converted into XACML or XACML-like constructs. And then also, some taxonomies around how you define roles, attributes, groups, et cetera, right? And so the answer really is that in most of these modernization efforts, it's never really truly a pure attribute-based implementation. You almost always end up seeing some hybrid where some of the functionality is perfectly fine to deliver through group-based. And so it doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. And so sort of having a, sort of very mindful and thoughtful way of walking through that and identifying what the application really needs, what the business is really asking for, and being able to describe that in a very consistent, plain English way. This is something that is a big part of what we're doing with our clients in this space.
Very good. All right, Dan, well, let's close out the webinar there. Thank you very much for joining me today for this session. It's great to work with you on this project. And I expect we'll do one or two more in the not too distant future.
All right, very good, Jerry. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the attendees for spending an hour with us today. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. And we'll see you next time at the next Axiomatics webinar. Thanks for joining, everyone. Goodbye for now.
All right, bye.